Hey everyone! Today I want to talk about the influence of money on our politics. We all know that campaign financing reform is necessary to level the playing field in our politics. $14.8 billion was spent on political campaigns in 2024 alone. More than 75% of legislative campaign funding, and in some cases up to 85%, is obtained through wealthy donors, PACs, and self-funding. Most PACs actually contribute fairly equally to Democrats and Republicans, secure in the knowledge that a bought politician is a bought politician, whether they resemble a donkey or an elephant. The amount of money spent on each election cycle has almost tripled since 2000. So what does this all mean? It means that your politicians don't give a flying about the opinions and desires of their electorate. They know that money wins elections through advertising and influence campaigns. Politicians make some subtle noises about fixing this or legislating that for the benefit of the common man, and then they roll out the advertising propaganda machine. The ads work because the average person is too tired from actual work and driven insane by social media echo chambers to evaluate anything critically. With this systemic problem in mind, let's talk a little bit about the history of campaign finance reform in the United States, which should help us determine the main obstacles to meaningful change. With the root causes of the problem in our mind, we can then talk about some radical solutions to the problem. Campaign finance history and the Supreme Court. Let's start with what approximates the beginning. In 1971, a highly respected lawyer and former president of the American Bar Association, Lewis Powell, wrote a memo to the director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce titled The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System. This document is viewed as the blueprint for the modern conservative movement. Powell, reacting to Ralph Nader's rising prominence, lamented that, quote, "As every business executive knows, few elements of American society today have as little influence in government as the American businessman, the corporation, or even the millions of corporate stockholders." In today's America, this statement is patently absurd. I doubt that it was even true in 1971. Powell also advocated for businesses to aggressively pursue their goals in the political arena. Quote, "Business must learn the lesson long ago learned by labor and other self-interest groups. This is a lesson that political power is necessary, that such power must be assiduously cultivated, and that when necessary, it must be used aggressively and with determination, without embarrassment and without the reluctance which has been so characteristic of American business." End quote. Just a year prior to his own ascendance to the Supreme Court, Powell wrote, quote, "Under our constitutional system, especially with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change." End quote. He advocated for a no-holds-barred approach to defending corporate interests. Quote, "There should be no hesitation to attack the Naders, the Marcuses, and others who openly seek destruction of the system. There should not be the slightest hesitation to press vigorously in all political arenas for support of the enterprise system, nor should there be a reluctance to penalize politically those who oppose it." End quote. It is astonishing how closely the conservatives and the Heritage Foundation have followed this advice. Everything from the emergence of Fox News to the influence of the Federalist Society on the makeup of our courts can be traced to this single document. In the decades since, American conservatives have sought to influence public opinion through corporate-owned media and to aggressively reshape the courts by filling as many seats with right-wing ideologues. The GOP Senate majority, led by Mitch McConnell, refused to accept Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court in his final year as president. The same Turtle Mitch forced through Amy Coney Barrett just months before Trump was supposed to leave the Oval Office. The Supreme Court has been one of the most influential anti-democratic forces in our society. Let's dive into the many ways they have prevented legislators from leveling the playing field of our elections. In 1971, the same year that the Powell Memo was written, and 1 year before Powell became a Supreme Court justice, Richard Nixon signed the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA for short, into law. This legislation, among other things, put limits on the amount of money that could be spent on political campaign advertising. In 1976, in Buckley v. Valeo, the Supreme Court, including Powell himself, struck down this provision of FECA as unconstitutional. The main foundational principle that resulted from this is the view that spending money to support political campaigns was now considered protected speech under the First Amendment. This one ruling was the basis for the chain of disastrous decisions culminating in Citizens United. The majority argued that, quote, a restriction on the amount of money a person or group can spend on political communication during a campaign necessarily reduces the quantity of expression by restricting the number of issues discussed, the depth of their exploration, and the size of the audience reached. In the 1978 First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti ruling, the same court, including Powell, ruled that corporations have a right to contribute to ballot initiative campaigns, protected by the First Amendment. The ruling came in response to a Massachusetts law that prohibited corporate donations in ballot initiatives unless the corporation's interests were directly involved. Lawmakers attempted to safeguard democracy. The Supreme Court sided with wealthy interests. In 2002, one of the last decent conservatives, John McCain, partnered with a Democrat, Russ Feingold, to draft and pass the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BRCA. This act was meant to limit the influence of soft money in politics, money that is received by the party for party-related business, rather than the hard money received by the candidate themselves for their election campaign. It banned parties from raising or spending any soft money. It also banned corporations from paying for ads that directly named a candidate too close to the day of the election. This law led to a slew of SCOTUS decisions that gutted the power that the government had to regulate elections. It is with these cases that the ideological capture of the Supreme Court became starkly evident. The first case, brought forward by our most favorite Republican Senate Majority Leader, Turtle Mitch McConnell in 2003, was called McConnell versus FEC. Miraculously, SCOTUS sided against the vile turtle and upheld the law. This would not stand much longer. Davis versus Federal Election Commission in 2008 successfully overturned the Millionaire's Amendment of the Act, written to counteract the influence of personal wealth in elections. It stipulated that if a political candidate spent more than $350,000 of personal funds on their campaign, their opponents would be able to raise triple the amount of money that they would usually be allowed to by the limits imposed by the BRCA. The liberal Justices Stevens, Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer disagreed with the ruling. As will become the pattern with subsequent cases, the conservatives won, and Justice Alito wrote the official ruling. Finally, in 2010, the famous Citizens United versus FEC ruled that the prohibition of all independent expenditures by corporations and unions in political campaigns was unconstitutional due to the First Amendment and the Buckley versus Valeo precedent. The ruling made along ideological lines yet again, created super PACs, organizations that could spend unlimited amounts of dark money in elections as long as they were not overtly collaborating with a candidate. State laws were also gutted by the Supreme Court. In 1998, Arizona voters approved a ballot measure called the Clean Elections Act. It established public financing for candidates. If a participating candidate was outspent by a candidate that chose to take donations, the participating candidate would receive public funding to catch up to the spending of their opponent. In 2011, the 5-4 Arizona Free Enterprise Club's Freedom Club PAC versus Bennett decision, what a mouthful, struck this down as unconstitutional, much like the Millionaires Amendment in the BRCA, again on ideological lines. In Randall versus Sorrell 2008 decision, the conservative majority struck down a Vermont law that placed strict limits on campaign contributions. The Buckley precedent was cited. Decades of Supreme Court decisions have systematically invalidated the ability of legislatures to effectively remove the influence of wealth in our politics. The court cases I cited here are just some of the most influential ones pertaining to campaign finance. The modern Supreme Court has enabled wealthy interests in other ways, such as allowing bribes after the fact in McDonnell versus United States. The people are desperate for campaign finance reforms. Most citizens are eager to reduce the impact of money on our politics. Yet time and time again, the Supreme Court has chosen to honor the power of wealth above the integrity of our democracy. There is a common saying that the law is what Supreme Court says. The justices of the Supreme Court are the most powerful people in the United States, wielding more influence over our affairs than the president or any congressperson. This is mainly due to the Marbury versus Madison decision all the way back in 1803, which allowed these 9 individuals to decide whether any law is unconstitutional and therefore unenforceable. The problem with this is not that the court has this power, it is that there is no defense against it. The only way to overturn a SCOTUS ruling is to have a different court consider overturning a previous ruling or through a constitutional convention that amends our founding documents. It is exceedingly difficult to amend our Constitution, even at less polarized times. There are checks and balances for other powers of the 3 branches. The president can veto legislation. Congress can override vetoes. The president nominates executive candidates and judges. Congress has to approve. There is no overturning a Supreme Court decision through any viable means. This is why presidential elections are so important. Not because presidents are extremely powerful. It is because they can appoint Supreme Court justices for lifetime terms. This is the reason the conservatives have poured so much energy and broken so many norms to install far-right justices on the highest bench in the land. Success stories. Even with all the cards stacked against them, some states and cities have actually implemented public financing options that have worked. In Arizona, the Clean Elections Act allowed participating candidates to receive public taxpayer funding if they commit to very strict public contribution limits. The program is opt-in and has been allowed to stand for now, partly because the conventional path is still available to any candidate. Roughly 34 candidates for state and federal positions participated in this program in 2024. In Seattle, voters approved a citizen-led initiative that granted each person a $25 voucher to use to support a political candidate during an election campaign. These democracy vouchers even the playing field from the other direction. Instead of limiting the power of wealthy donors, they instead amplify the First Amendment money speech of regular people. Approved by Denver voters in November 2018, the Fair Elections Fund provides public matching funds to candidates for municipal offices. The fund matches donations of $50 or less at a 9-to-1 ratio for candidates who agree to raise money in lower amounts and take contributions only from individuals and small donor committees. These initiatives prove that some public financing is possible, even with restrictions imposed by the Supreme Court, if only enough political will is available. The end goal. In order to fight for campaign finance reform, we should outline the end goal. In my view, the goal should be to remove financing and fundraising from the equation entirely. Public financing should be the only type of financing allowed. The candidates we elect should not be masters of fundraising and shaking hands. We should elect people based on how persuasive their ideas are and how competent they are. The art of fundraising has nothing at all to do with how well someone is able to serve the public good as a politician. We should severely limit the amount of political advertising that is allowed to run in our media. During election season, people are inundated with political advertising. Modern technology is capable of precisely targeting specific segments of society, creating echo chambers and polarizing constituents. As a replacement, the government should create a centralized site where candidates can be listed and upload their media and message. The government should also host regular taxpayer-funded town halls and debates in the lead up to the election. We should standardize and streamline as much as possible the campaigning process to allow better ideas and people to easily navigate their way to winning elections. The sheer scale of effort required to win a seat is an insurmountable obstacle to most people that would make excellent lawmakers. Let's remove that obstacle and open the door for politics for everyone. Obviously, these goals run afoul of the many SCOTUS decisions I outlined earlier. So how do we get there? Challenging the Supreme Court. SCOTUS is extremely powerful. There are two ways we can challenge their rulings. One way to overturn these rulings is via amending the Constitution. To even propose an amendment requires 2/3 of Congress and 2/3 of state legislatures. To ratify it, it requires 3/4 of state legislatures. With half of our states captured by MAGA sycophants, it will be impossible to even call for a convention. The second way to fight is by passing laws that directly violate Buckley versus Valeo and appealing them all the way to the Supreme Court in the hopes that the decision will be overturned. With the current far-right SCOTUS supermajority, this approach is not feasible. There are ways to change the makeup of the court, however. First, we can go slow and steady, take a page out of the Heritage Foundation playbook, and work to install progressive judges throughout government by bending rules and breaking norms over the course of decades. However, I don't believe that we have decades. MAGA is an authoritarian personality cult that has ceased to play by the rules at all. They trample over the First Amendment rights of our university students, Fifth Amendment rights of our immigrants, trampling Article 1 by concentrating power in the president, engaging in open corruption, building concentration camps, and all manner of other atrocities. The SCOTUS conservative supermajority appears to fully support this movement. We cannot continue to play by the rules. We have to start breaking norms in order to have any chance of salvaging at least some pieces of democracy. For that reason, I advocate for approach number 2. The Constitution does not explicitly define the size of the Supreme Court. Historically, the size of the Supreme Court has changed 6 times, ranging from 5 to 10 justices, before settling at the current 9 in 1869. If the Democrats are able to get a majority in the House, Senate, and the presidency, which is not out of the realm of possibility with how lawless the GOP has become, they must increase the size of the Supreme Court significantly. The seats should be filled with pro-democracy judges, and court cases should be ready for challenging Buckley and Citizens United, among other rulings. Finally, our representatives should advocate for a constitutional convention. There are a few reforms that cannot be accomplished through the regular political process. First, we need term limits for the Supreme Court, and possibly the lower courts as well. We can stagger the terms of SCOTUS judges in such a way that every president is able to appoint 2 judges. Second, the president should not have the power to appoint judges. Similar to independent redistricting commissions, an independent bipartisan commission composed of rotating members of Congress should propose which judges should be appointed. We must guard against ideological capture of the court and ensure that it remains impartial. It will also lift the importance we place on presidential elections. Third, the people at large should have the power to hold SCOTUS accountable. It should be possible for a large enough group of citizens to call a referendum on a particularly unpopular or undemocratic ruling. A 2/3 majority of voters should be able to make SCOTUS reconsider a ruling in favor of a dissenting judge. This provides a necessary check on the unlimited power of the Supreme Court. All of these ideas seem out of reach. However, the Constitution has been amended 27 times. When times call for it, we must act. It is a matter of convincing our politicians that radical change is necessary to preserve our republic. Local change. But what can we do in the meantime while these lofty constitutional reforms are out of reach? One extremely important thing we can all do is to run for local elected office as independents against incumbent Republicans. We should also primary incumbent corporate-owned Democrats in every seat possible, but take care not to siphon votes away from them in general elections. A corporate Democrat is still preferable to a MAGA Republican. When we run, we should center electoral reforms in our campaign. Campaign financing reforms, similar to Arizona's Clean Election Act or Seattle's democracy vouchers, is possible in all other states and cities. We should push for these reforms wherever we live. The more we crack open the door to candidates that do not answer to wealthy donors, the more we can counteract their influence. If you're unable or unwilling to run, the best thing to do would be to vote for progressive pro-democracy candidates and support their campaigns. Additionally, spread the message of campaign finance reform as widely as possible. Call your elected representatives and pressure them to talk about it. Discuss it with your friends at the bar. If we don't reform our system, we are doomed to authoritarianism, falling living standards, and a bleak future of techno-feudal slavery. We have to be the change we need. No one else is going to save us.